Good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. Appreciate you joining the class. I'm looking forward to it. We are starting our fourth Sunday, our fourth week. We'll have 3 more weeks, including this week, in our stewardship class. For those who are new to us, we've been going through some concepts of stewardship. And this morning, if you don't have a sheet, there's sheets on the back for today's class and Wednesday's class, and then also for the next 2 weeks as well. They're out there. So if you don't have a sheet or you want to pick one up for future classes, they're out there in the foyer. Before we get going on this morning's lesson, this morning's topic of spending and saving to glorify God, I've asked Drew Lopez to lead us in a word of prayer. Amen. Thank you. Okay, so spending and saving to glorify God. The purposes of these things are to glorify God. That's our goal, that's our aim, that's what we ought to be striving for. And I think it's natural and obvious in a stewardship class for us to talk about spending to glorify God. I think that's an obvious point and an obvious consideration. What may not be as obvious, as natural to think about, is how are we saving to glorify God? What are we storing up for? What is our purpose in what we are collecting and the storehouses that we are growing? What is the purpose of our saving, and how does our saving glorify God? The Bible is not silent on this topic. I want to go through a few different passages as we consider the idea of how to properly and how to improperly save when it comes to trying to glorify God. And I want to ask the question before we read the verses for you to be dwelling on what wisdom, what principles, or life lessons do we learn from the following passages. So we're going to start this morning in Proverbs 11, verse 26. So Proverbs 11, verse 26, it says, "The people curse him who holds back grain." So whatever individual has these assets, has these goods, has this grain, the people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. In a previous class, we had talked about how the Egyptians, through the blessings of God and Joseph and his wisdom and his being able to interpret the dream, they were going to have 7 years of plenty, and then they were going to have 7 years of famine. And so for 7 years, they put aside, and they were increasing the stores, waiting for the 7 years of famine to come. And I wonder if an example to try to apply this passage, an example could be going back to the story of Egypt. What would the surrounding peoples had said? What would the surrounding nations have thought of the Egyptians if they weren't willing to sell from their abundance? What if they weren't willing to sell and therefore share in their abundance of the goods that they had stored up for 7 years? I can only imagine the people of the surrounding nations who were suffering, who were starving, who were in need, who saw it right there and couldn't obtain it because it wasn't theirs. I can imagine them thinking, well, how stingy, right? How inconsiderate, how selfish. There's no honor, there's no class in that person or that nation, which ultimately would lead to resentment and ultimately could lead to hatred. So when you go back to the passage, the people curse him who holds back grain. That's coming from a thought of hatred. That's coming from a thought of resentment. That's coming from a thought of bitterness. I'm so bitter that I'm going to curse the person who withholds the grain. But in contrast, a blessing is on him who sells it. So when we're storing up, what are we doing with it? Are we withholding it from good? Are we withholding it from those who could benefit from help? Are we withholding it from God's glory and his purposes? If we are, then maybe we're creating this resentment in other people, right? We want to be a people who are saving in order for that savings to ultimately do good. Proverbs 11:24. So in the same reading, Proverbs 11:24 says, "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want." So one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. So I want to ask the question this morning, the one who gives freely, how is he growing richer? How does he grow richer? If he's giving it all away, how is he able to grow richer? Okay, so Drew says perhaps it's those. So how does he grow richer? Drew says perhaps it's the intangibles that you can't measure. And what are some of the things that you can't measure by weight of gold, by money, by wealth, right? Like maybe it's friendships. Maybe it's love and consideration and thoughtfulness from others, right? Maybe you can't measure that with gold and riches, but certainly he's growing in those. Thank you. Dan? Good. So Dan said you gain the satisfaction. You gain the enjoyment of helping others. So that is immensely satisfactory, and you can't put a price tag on that. When you go out of your way to help somebody, and that's appreciated. When you go out of your way to help somebody, and it brings a smile to their face, and that appreciation is communicated back to you, you can't put a price tag on that. There's no amount of money to weigh against that. That person is growing richer even though they're scattering their riches on others. Jimmy?
Well, and I agree with all that. God blesses us. That's how we have that we had that we could share or sell. He said down below. God will make us as rich in that regard as we need to be, so long as we're serving Him with it, and there's a need for us to help others.
Very good. Todd? Yeah.
I think children, by nature, most children at least, especially when they're younger, are all selfish. And humans tend to grow that way as they get older, become selfish. And a phrase has been developed, put out there, especially when you're trying to get money from people for a cause, for religious service, for charity, you give until it hurts. So in some sense, people understand that can be a painful thing for some people to give, but if you look at what it's saying here, it says give until it doesn't hurt. Give until it becomes fun. Give until you enjoy it. And then your mindset changes when you adopt that mentality. It becomes pleasurable for you to do that.
Very good. Grows richer in friendship, grows richer in memories, grows richer in allies. You're gaining support by showing support. And then on the flip side of that, another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Suffers want how? Right? If he's storing it up and he's keeping it for himself, how is he suffering want? What is there to want? I'm keeping it all to myself. What more could I want? And I think the answer for us this morning is pretty clear. For the hoarder, there is never enough. For the hoarder, for the person who's just going to want to stockpile and stockpile and stockpile and not share any of it, and not give God the glory in their savings, it's never going to be enough. With hoarding comes missing out on showing kindness and friendliness, which obviously is a key component to making friends. To the one who only hoards up and stores up for themselves, not trying to spread God's agenda, that person is going to have a difficult time making friends and showing kindness. He's suffering want because there's no memories to be made if I'm just keeping it to myself. And it's hard to make allies when you are only concerned with self. Proverbs 21, verse 13 says, "Whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered." So how can you store up, but be lacking and be wanting? Well, you can have all the money in the world, but if you have no friendship, if you have no emotional support, if you have no one to share these items with, how sad that is. And of course, that person is left wanting. Finally, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Ecclesiastes 5, 7 and 8. "Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all of his toil." He has no one to share it with. He has no one to give it to. He has no plan in sight to pass these things along. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, "For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure?" This also is vanity and an unhappy business. It is very sad to dwell on the man who has no plan nor anyone to share his savings with. The very next verse in Ecclesiastes is the beginning to a very famous passage. It's a passage that's oftentimes read at a marriage ceremony, at a wedding. "Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil." And I would submit to you, in the context of Ecclesiastes 5, 7, and 8, maybe the good reward is simply that you have someone to share the fruit of your toil with. And so if you're toiling, and you're toiling, and you're toiling, and there's no plan to share that, there's no plan to spread God's agenda and God's goals and God's wants and desires to give God the glory, and you've got no one to share it with, I would say stop. And find somebody, find a higher purpose, find a higher calling for your toil. And that way you can work hard, but also enjoy the fruit of your labor. The point of looking at these passages as we dive into the sheet today, titled "Spending and Saving to Glorify God," is that there's both a godly way to spend the money and there's a godly way to save the money we've been given. And I think a lot of times the attention, like I said earlier, goes towards the spending, but I also quickly wanted to hit on what the Bible has to say about our savings and our attitudes towards it. So as we move on into how we spend and how our spending is to glorify God, are there any comments to be had regarding how we save and how we store up? Carl?
Yeah, I was thinking Acts 20:35, it's more blessed to give than to receive. So that's a statement by Jesus, and it fits with what you're saying. Unless we're sharing it, it's not blessed.
Very good. So Carl reminded us what Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And then he went on to say that it's if you're not sharing it, then it's not a blessing. And that's spot on. Anything else? Rick? I think,
It's difficult to understand in such a wealthy society as us that we live in, where our emphasis needs to be. But if we have the basic idea of I see a need and I want to fulfill it, that fitting is special.
I think the main point you're making, which I would completely agree, is that we have to be intentional. It has to be on purpose that we're thinking of good ways, biblical ways, godly ways to not just accumulate, but then to disperse and share for, again, God's glory. Yes?
We talk about savings. I like to think of things in terms of endowments in colleges and foundations and things that are charitable. They will plan ahead after those people have died, so that there are funds set aside so that perpetuity can continue to grow. So if we are supporting a man in South America, do we think about if that man's younger than us, or if we're supporting people, do we plan to keep supporting him after we're dead? If it's possible to make those kind of plans, that's what savings do. It makes plans beyond what is in front of you for the next 5 or 10 years. Even if they're very good goals about supporting a preacher somewhere, you want that to keep happen perpetually if you can. There are layers to it.
Right. And there's a plan in place so that ultimately the godly goals that we have in place are going to be accomplished. That's the purpose of the endowment. That's the purpose of the savings, is so that these goals can ultimately be accomplished. So our spending must glorify God. And as stewards, we realize that we are spending what ultimately belongs to God. When life has ended, we will give an account for how we have spent the funds entrusted to us. And some of these expenditures might include the following. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of these expenditures are going to include clothing, transportation, communication, children's toys, education, health care, or recreation. And in all of these things, and many, many more, we want to have been able to say that we made these things work for God. So whatever we're spending our funds on, wherever we're spending our time, we want to be able to make the assertion that, hey, this was done for God. There needs to be a spiritual component. There should be both a material and a spiritual component to the why behind our spending and our purchases. And this only makes sense if we go back and remember what our role is. This only makes sense if we go back and understand what our position is in relation to our Heavenly Father. If our Heavenly Father is the master, if our Heavenly Father is the king, and we are simply the agent and the steward, it would make sense to us that we are going to have to give an account, right? So if we're spending quite a bit of money on these things that we just mentioned, we need to be ready and ultimately ready to give an account. So I want to go through a few of these examples. And in these examples, I'm going to provide the more obvious material reasons and goals. That's the easy part. So why do you do this? Well, here's the material reason for it. I'm going to provide that. And then I'm going to ask the question, what is the spiritual reason behind it? Or what spiritual reasons should we have for some of these expenditures or some of these time commitments? Okay? So our family acquires food and personal items. All right, so the material reason for that would be, well, for health, for sustainability, for energy, and for comfort, right? So that's the material reason for health and for comfort. But what is the spiritual reason behind acquiring food and personal items? Suzanne?
I was thinking about this food thing. As you said, we need food to nourish our bodies, but we have this amount of money for food, and do we spend it on going out to eat and eating junk, or do we spend it on healthy things that are going to nourish our body so
Very, very good. So one of the points that Suzanne made was, hey, we make choices in buying our food, and when we make good, healthy choices, or that's the reasoning behind the good, healthy choices, is so that I can have a long-lasting life of work and diligence in God's kingdom. That's the spiritual component, right? So we need to sustain ourselves. We need to gain energy. That only makes common sense. But if the why behind it is, hey, because we want to have strength to go about our business, to live godly lives, that's the spiritual component. We also have a responsibility to provide for our families. So we want to put food on the table, but we also want to be a good example. We want to provide for our families. We don't want to have someone else have to provide for our own families. And so that's another spiritual component to why we would put food on the table. Todd?
We're supposed to be hospitable people. One of the qualifications for elders to be hospitable. If you can't and haven't prepared yourself to bring people into your house or entertain strangers or help someone out, a neighbor that needs help, then you haven't prepared. If you have the opportunity to do that, you choose not to. You're not a hospitable person.
Very good. And so the next, going right into the next example would be like housing. Housing is acquired. So like we spend money on food, we spend money on housing. And so like the material reason for that was, well, hey, like we need a place to stay, we need shelter, we need safety. Those are the material reasons. But the spiritual reasons Todd just gave to us is we need to be a hospitable people. We need to be welcoming to strangers. We need to have others into our homes for Bible studies, to grow in fellowship outside of these walls. We need to be building relationships so that when times get tough, I know how to help you and to support you, and I know you well enough to know where you need help and why you need the help. We're growing closer together. Romans 12:13, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. So every month when we're sending, money on rent, we're spending money on our mortgage, we're buying this for shelter. There's the physical component, the material component, and then there's the spiritual component. Our children are raised and instructed, right? So the material, practical reason for this is so that, hey, that they become independent adults, right? Like we eventually get them out of the house on their own. They're functioning in society. So we raise these children for a practical reason so they can become independent and they can assimilate into society, caring for themselves and having a realistic understanding of how the world works, right? So that's the material reason. That's the practical reason why we raise them up. But what is the spiritual reason that we would raise our children up to learn how to live in a society on their own and independently? Suzanne?
For one thing, if you teach children that all they have to do is say, hey, Dad, I need $50 for this, or, $100 for that, or I want, the latest color iPhone, or whatever it is, and they'll give it to you, then that shows them that the world owes them something. If you raise them so that they need to work, whether it's a little kid doing a little few chores so they can have a little bit of money to get what they want or something like this, then it gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them a sense of, yes, I need to do something in order to get something. And I don't know, I think that it's just wiser to show children that they need, because the world doesn't owe them anything.
Absolutely. So when we're going about raising our children, teach them how life should work and how society works, like part of that is we want to train them to have an attitude that things aren't owed to them. Things aren't going to just be given to them. And when that type of person is in the workplace, when that type of person is out in the field working in whatever field they choose, they're not going to bring resentment to their teammates because they're carrying their own load. They're not going to be discontent or a complainer because, hey, they know, sometimes things just don't go my way and it's not always going to be given to me. So certainly there's a spiritual component to that. Lynn?
Also, we raise up children so
Very good. Yeah, Lynn said we send our children out like arrows so that ultimately they can have been taught and then go out and teach others. That's good. Dan?
Yeah, just thinking about kids, I want to raise my kids to recognize the importance of work, the importance of providing for their food and clothing. I mean, Paul said, food and clothing, with those, you should be content. But then also, like you talk about the spiritual side, Jesus said, doesn't life consist of more than food and clothes? So I want them to recognize that what we do for our survival in a physical world is like but a very small part of their existence. Their existence is spiritual existence, and they need to pay a lot more attention to the spiritual side of things and be happy with even just the basics of survival.
Very good. Very good. So kind of one of the things I took away from that was it's not just about the basics, but the basics are our means to a greater end, right? Like we put food on the table and we clothe ourselves, and that's great, but that helps us go on and do bigger and more important things in God's kingdom. Very good. Last example, or last question, and this one for me is hits home. We're getting ready to signed up Leah for softball yesterday, and we're getting ready to do the boys t-ball, and we're gonna have 3 in youth sports. So this is mostly for me, but maybe others would benefit from this. Our children are enrolled in youth sports, requiring investments in both money and time. Right? So the material reason could be it's great exercise, and it's a good opportunity to grow athletic skills. And so, when I'm trying to figure out the why behind why are we hurting our kids to youth sports? Like it's hectic, right? It's crazy. Y'all get that. So why are we doing it? Well, it can't just be for the material reasons. If it is, then I'm missing the mark, and I'm not being a very good father to my kids. There's got to be a spiritual reason. And so maybe I emphasize, hey, this is a good opportunity to grow your social skills. It's an opportunity for you to be around other individuals and to expose the child to opportunities to be a good example and to be a good influence. It doesn't just happen, right? Like we don't just send them off to college and all of a sudden they're going to learn to be a good example, to be a good influence, to learn to say no to things that, hey, I'm not with that. That's not godly. You train them. And maybe part of that training is you put them into youth sports and they learn from a young age, hey, not everyone is on board with God as their master. You're going to be influenced by that, and so you learn, hey, I live in a world that is not always on God's path, and I have to be in the world, not of the world. It teaches discipline and accountability to others outside oneself. I can tell you it's not good enough for some of my children. It's not good enough just for some of my children when their brother or sister is upset with them. Sometimes they just don't care. In fact, they will do things just to upset a brother and a sister. But when you're accountable to a team, and they need you to throw properly and to catch properly in order to get an out, when they need you to run down the line so that you can, not be the third out and a run score, like when you're held accountable to other people, maybe that teaches them, hey, life is bigger than myself, right? It's not just about me. There's a team out there counting on me. And maybe it teaches the child that there are other authority figures in this life besides mom and dad, and that those authority figures need to be respected, right? So maybe there should be spiritual components and reasons to even when we herd our children to youth sports. So the lesson to be gained in going through these examples is that in all things, in spending or saving, there needs to be both a material and a spiritual component. And if we haven't spent the time to think through that, if we haven't spent the time to plan, how is this investment or this spending or this savings going to have a spiritual component, then we need to hit the pause button And we need to think through that. How is this glorifying God? Any thoughts or comments on any of that? Yes. Very good. Brother Lopez mentioned that when they're in that, athletic event, life doesn't just stop. You don't stop being a child of God. Your family responsibilities, your school responsibilities, they don't just stop. So you're teaching them how to set priorities and to have multiple lanes of responsibility. So that's great. Carl.
So, we've got 5 kids, and not any of them are like the others, okay? Everyone's different, so one's good at sports, one's good at art, one's good at music, and so we as parents have to find where to invest our children's future, so that they will develop, because all of the attributes of which Rick is talking about, that we want God to be interjected into whatever their life is about, needs to be interjected in those individual activities. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. But we as parents really need to look at that.
Very good. All right, so the Bible records for us, and we're going to go through a couple of these examples, negative examples for us to explore and to learn from with having a lack of planning and a spiritual component in our spending of money, spending of time. There's a few examples that I want to look at. So let's go first to Haggai chapter 1. And we're going to read verses 2 through 11. Can I get a volunteer for that reading? Haggai 1, verses 2 through 11. Thanks, Stan.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. And the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them into a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, that I may be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, and behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Declares the Lord of hosts. Because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. Therefore the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And I have called for a drought on the land, and the hills on the grain, the new wine, and the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and all their labors.
Thank you. So verses 5 and 6 have always been just remarkable to me. They're going about their business just like anyone would. They are sowing, they're working, they're eating, drinking, clothing themselves, but nothing they ever do seems to be of any use, seems to be of any profit. And it doesn't sound like these are a lazy people, right? Certainly they are putting in the work, and certainly they're putting in the effort. They aren't sitting back waiting for things to be handed to them. They're not wanting a handout. They keep grinding, and they keep working. Certainly, like we could we could praise their steadfastness. They don't just give up. Like, things aren't going well and they continue on. Things aren't going well and they continue on. They are steadfast, surely. And things continually aren't going their way, and yet they keep at it. So what is their problem? What is their problem? Why is God directly against these people? And the answer is because God is not glorified in their lives. God is not glorified in their efforts. In verse 8, it says, "Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified." And so I would say, like, the lesson in Haggai, is it not so very relevant for us today? It says, each of you busies himself with his own house. And you could insert any word in there that you want. Any word that's applicable to you, and I could do the same for me. I busy myself with my own stuff, my own job, my own hobbies, my own friends, my own goals, my own agendas. I'm busying myself with any number of things. And yet, God is not being glorified. In other words, God's house is lying in ruins while I'm busying myself with my own house. If we are so busy that we only ever have time for our own house, then we need to reevaluate our motives and our love for God and his people. We need to be about the glorification of God. Another example for us to go and review is in Ezekiel chapter 16. So in Ezekiel 16, I want you to listen to how God describes the misuse of the assets. Furthermore, see who God stated truly owned the assets. So see how they misused the assets, and then see God's position on who actually owned the assets. So I'll start in verse 10. We're not going to read all the verses. I'll be skipping around some, but this is Ezekiel 16, 10 through 19. It starts, "I clothed you also with embroidered clothing, and shod you with fine leather. I wrapped you in fine linen and covered you with silk, and I adorned you with ornaments." Now he's speaking to the Israelites. "I adorned you with ornaments and put bracelets on your wrists and a chain on your neck. And I put a ring on your nose and earrings in your ears and a beautiful crown on your head. You took some of your clothes and made for yourselves high places of various colors and placed the harlot on them. You also took your beautiful jewels made of my gold and my silver, which I had given you, and made for yourself male images that you might play the harlot with them. Then you took your embroidered cloth and covered them and offered my oil and my incense before them. Also my bread, which I gave you fine flour, oil, and honey with, which I fed you, you would offer before them for a soothing aroma." So this already sounds terrible. This already sounds bad enough, but if you were to go back earlier in the passage, the Israelites were described as a babe that could not fend for themselves in any regard. They were completely and utterly dependent upon God, and God came in and saved them. He came and saved them from their inability to help themselves, and so he nurtured them, and he grew them. He clothed them. He gave them assets to have and to use. And this is how they repaid their father. This is how they paid their God. And in the context, this is how they repaid their husband. "I saved you, and you threw them all away via going after sinful desires." This was all sinful and poor stewardship, which failed in bringing glory to God. The actions of the Israelites, these were the symptoms of deeper problems. They're throwing away their assets, spending them on things that didn't glorify God. These were the symptoms of a bigger problem. So I want to ask the question, after reading that passage and us talking about it a little bit, what at the core, what at the root of the matter, at the root of the problem, led them away from God into these dishonorable offenses. Exactly. So Drew said they trusted in their own beauty, and they had trusted in what they had been given. And so one of the things that I had written down was they had a forgetfulness of where those blessings had come from. They had a forgetfulness of God's blessings and God's grace upon them. And to the point where they forgot completely, to where they discarded their God. Very good. So that is a core problem that ultimately led to them squandering the assets. What else is a core problem here? Rick?
I'm going to go to the example of Martha and Mary with Jesus, and in fact, that Martha was paying attention to Jesus, and Mary was running around and trying to get things done. There's a place for both of those, but it's you're having your priorities straight. And the fact that we get caught up in living our lives, and we don't realize how much we get caught up in living our lives. And it's easy to do because so much happens and so much goes on, and we have so many things we do. We forget to step back and say, what is our real priority? And these people did the same exact thing. They didn't understand their real priority. They just went about living their lives and doing things that they wanted to do and all this stuff, and you get caught up in it.
So,
It's taking the step back that's difficult.
so at the core, I would summarize that they had a lack of love for God, selfishness, arrogance, lust. All of these things were at the core of the problem. And ultimately what happened, was a squandering of God's assets. And I say God's assets because that's exactly how it's described. Right? That's exactly how Ezekiel describes it. Notice what God says. It was my oil. It was my silver. It was my gold. It was my bread that you squandered and wasted. Yes, it was in your possession. I was the master and you were the steward and you squandered it. They were mine and you misused it. And so these are two, in Haggai and Ezekiel, these are two negative examples that we wanted to go through and learn from. And the bell is ringing, so on Wednesday we'll look more at maybe some practical examples and ways in which we can learn from those stories. And we can pivot to not misusing, but to glorifying God with our savings and our